In a small barn on the edge of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, sometime in the early 1920s, an Amish farmer, named after his grandfather, as most Amish farmers are, looked out at his tomato rows and saw something that would have destroyed a modern grower entirely. Late blight. The dark water-soaked lesions spreading across the leaves like a slow fire. The white mold forming underneath. The smell of rot already rising from the vines in the August heat. He did not call a county extension agent. He did not drive to a farm supply store. He walked to his barn, reached into a wooden bin that had sat in the same corner since his grandfather built that barn, and pulled out a fine gray-white powder that cost him nothing. And those tomatoes survived. Every single one of them. That is not a folk tale. That is a documented practice that Amish farming communities across Lancaster County, Holmes County in Ohio, and LaGrange County in Indiana have preserved through generations, while the Amish agricultural system spent roughly a century building a replacement that costs you money every single season and works worse. Here is the question that is going to stay open for the next several minutes. How does a powder that costs less than $1 stop one of the most destructive plant diseases in the history of American agriculture? And why has that fact been systematically buried since the 1940s? Before you get the answer to that, you need to understand what blight actually is and why it has been treated for decades as something only industrial chemistry can solve. Because that framing that you need a corporation to protect your garden is the foundation of a business model worth billions of dollars. And it is not even remotely true. If you have a garden and you are already tired of being told what product to buy every spring, drop the number 47 inches, the comments right now. Or better yet, tell us what state you are growing in. Let's see how many of us are out here. Late blight, Phytophthora infestans. This is the same organism, not a fungus exactly, but a water mold, an Umicide, that triggered the Irish potato famine between 1845 and 1852, killing over 1 million people and forcing another million to emigrate. When Irish and German immigrants arrived in Pennsylvania in the mid-1800s, they brought that knowledge with them. They had lived through what blight could do. They did not take it lightly. And the Amish communities that settled in Lancaster County during the 18th and early 19th centuries, many of them of Swiss, German, and Alsatian descent, carried with them a body of practical agricultural knowledge that had been tested under conditions modern American growers can barely imagine. Drought, war, disease, complete dependence on what the land produced. You either solved the problem with what you had, or you did not eat. What they used for generations before a single bag of synthetic fungicide ever appeared on an American farm supply shelf was wood ash. Specifically, the fine gray powder left in the firebox after burning hardwood. Oak, maple, hickory, the same wood they burned to heat their homes and cook their food. Nothing new was needed. Nothing was purchased. The ash was simply there, as a byproduct of life on a working farm, and it was worth more than most people today realize. That bin in the corner of that Lancaster County barn was not filled with a specialty product. It was filled with what used to be firewood. The mechanism here is not mystical. It is chemistry. And it is worth understanding, because once you understand it, you will never look at your fireplace ash the same way again. Wood ash is primarily calcium carbonate, calcium oxide, and potassium carbonate potash, the same compound that gave potassium its chemical symbol K from the word kalium, which itself comes from the Arabic word for ash. Potassium carbonate is strongly alkaline. When it contacts water, rain, dew, the moisture on a leaf surface, it creates a briefly alkaline microenvironment on that surface. Phytophthora infestans, the organism that causes late blight, requires a very specific pH range to germinate and penetrate plant tissue. Alkaline conditions disrupt its cell membrane function and inhibit spore germination. This is not folk wisdom dressed up as science. This is basic biochemistry that any plant pathologist will confirm. But here is the part the industry spent decades hoping you would never put together. If wood ash creates alkaline conditions on leaf surfaces that inhibit blight spore germination, and if that effect costs nothing, then there is no product to sell. And in the American agricultural economy as it was restructured after World War II, the absence of a product to sell was not acceptable. Let's talk about what happened after 1945. because this is where the story of wood ash and blight gets uncomfortable for some very powerful people. The chemical industry that had been producing synthetic compounds for the war effort, including organophosphate compounds, originally developed as nerve agents, found itself in 1945 with enormous production capacity and no war to supply. The pivot to agricultural chemistry was not accidental. It was deliberate and it was fast. Companies including Dow Chemical and what would eventually become the modern Bayer Corporation began converting wartime chemical production lines into pesticide and fungicide manufacturing. The first generation of synthetic fungicides was aggressively marketed to American farmers in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, backed by USDA extension programs that were, to put it plainly, deeply intertwined with industry funding and interests. Donald Kraybill, the sociologist and one of the most respected academic authorities on Amish culture. His books, including The Riddle of Amish Culture and Amish Society, have been cited in academic literature for decades, documented extensively what happened to traditional Amish farming practices during this period. While the broader American farming community was being told that the old methods were primitive and inefficient, Amish communities maintained what Kraybill describes as a deliberate and conscious boundary against the adoption of technologies and practices that would create external dependence. The Amish did not refuse synthetic fungicides because they were unaware of them. In many cases, they were aware. They refused them because dependence on purchased inputs contradicted the theological and practical principle of Gelassenheit yielding, self-sufficiency, separation from a world organized around consumption and debt. John Hostetler, the Mennonite scholar whose landmark study Amish Society was first published in 1963 and revised multiple times through the 1990s, documented the agricultural practices of Holmes County, Ohio communities in particular. Hostetler noted that Amish farmers in that region maintained soil amendment and pest management practices dating to their European origins, practices involving wood, ash, compost, green manures, and crop rotation that produced yields comparable to neighboring non-Amish farms without synthetic inputs. This was not considered noteworthy by the agricultural mainstream at the time. It should have been front-page news. It was not, because it implied that the synthetic input revolution was a commercial project, not an agronomic necessity. Here's where this gets personal for anyone who grew up watching their grandfather garden. Think about the 1950s for a moment. Your grandfather or his generation was already being told by the county extension agent, by the seed company representative who showed up in a clean truck, by the magazine advertisements, that the new way was the better way. That Bordeaux mixture, the old copper sulfate and lime spray that had been used since the 1880s, was being replaced by newer, more targeted chemistry. That wood ash was primitive. That compost was unsanitary. The language of progress was used to reframe centuries of agricultural intelligence as ignorance. And most American farmers, not because they were stupid, but because the social pressure and the economic incentives were overwhelming, went along with it. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, who served under Nixon from 1971 to 1976, made this explicit when he told American farmers to get big or get out. That phrase was not rhetorical. It was policy. Small farms that relied on self-sufficient practices were structurally pushed out of viability, and the knowledge those farms carried went with them. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, take a moment right now and do it. Every week we put out videos exactly like this one, about the methods the industry buried, the wisdom the Amish kept, and the food independence that most Americans surrendered without ever being asked if they wanted to. This is not gardening content. This is American history. Subscribe and make sure you do not miss what is coming next. Now back to the ash, because there is more here than just blight, and the Amish knew it. A 73-year-old farmer in Holmes County, Ohio, whose name you will never find in a database, who learned this from his father, who learned it from his father, applies wood ash to his tomato rows not once, but 3 times across the growing season. He dusts the lower leaves in early June when the plants are establishing. He dusts again after the first rain in July when humidity climbs and blight pressure starts building. And he dusts a 3rd time in late July or early August when the nights get cool and wet again, exactly the conditions under which Phytophthora infestans thrives. He has not lost a tomato crop to blight in his memory. He is not a miracle worker. He is applying a substance that shifts the surface pH of his plants at the exact moments when the pathogen is most vulnerable. But there is another layer here that most people miss completely. Wood ash is not just alkaline. It is a source of potassium, calcium, and magnesium, three of the elements most directly linked to plant disease resistance. Potassium regulates the opening and closing of stomata, the microscopic pores on leaf surfaces. When potassium levels are adequate, stomata close more efficiently under stress, reducing the entry points for pathogen penetration. Calcium strengthens cell walls, making them physically harder for fungal and oomycete hyphae to breach. Magnesium is the central atom in the chlorophyll molecule. Adequate magnesium means more efficient photosynthesis, which means a plant with more metabolic energy to mount its own immune response. Wood ash delivers all three, slowly, in a form the plant can use directly through both foliar uptake and soil amendment. And here is what the industry spent decades hoping you would never figure out. The plants fed with wood ash were not just chemically protected from the outside, they were structurally stronger from the inside. Compare that to what Bayer's fungicide product line sells you today. The active ingredients in most commercial late blight fungicides, compounds like chlorothalonil, mancozeb, or the newer SDHI class fungicides, work by disrupting enzyme pathways in the pathogen. They are contact or systemic protectants. They do not strengthen the plant, they do not improve soil biology, they leave residues on the fruit and in the soil. Chlorothalonil was classified by the EPA as a likely human carcinogen. The European Union banned it for agricultural use in 2019. You can still buy it in the United States. And Bayer, which acquired Monsanto in 2018 for $63 billion and is currently the largest agrochemical company in the world, sells you that chemistry every spring because there is no margin in telling you to save your fireplace ash. Let's talk about cost for a moment, because this comparison is almost insulting when you lay it out plainly. A 1-pound container of a major brand copper fungicide for tomatoes, one of the more natural options on the market, retails between $8 and $14 and covers a modest garden for perhaps 2 applications. A full season of protection following the label directions can cost a home gardener $30 to $60 for fungicide alone, on top of whatever else they are spending. Wood ash costs nothing if you burn wood for heat. If you do not, you can often get it free from neighbors, from fireplaces, from wood-burning pizza restaurants, from local sawyers. Many Amish communities in Lancaster County have long shared ash between households. As a matter of course, it was a communal resource. The idea that protecting your food requires a corporate supply chain is not a natural truth. It is a manufactured dependency, and it is approximately 70 years old. Here is the moment everything changed. In 1947, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, was amended to require registration of all pesticide products sold in interstate commerce. This was presented as consumer protection, and in some ways it was. But registration required scientific testing that cost money that an individual farmer saving wood ash obviously could not spend. The effect, whether intended or not, was to formalize the distinction between registered products and unregistered practices. Wood ash was never going to be registered. There was no company behind it, no profit motive to fund the studies, and without registration, it had no official standing in the agronomic advice apparatus. No extension agent would recommend it, no land-grant university would publish trials on it, no industry-sponsored field guide would include it. It did not become less effective. It became invisible. This is what the Amish protected themselves from through their structural separation. By refusing to integrate with the commercial agricultural economy, they preserved practices that the rest of America forgot by legislative and market architecture. They did not fight the system. They simply stayed outside it, and their tomatoes kept growing. There is one more thing about wood ash that the record shows the Amish understood in a way that took mainstream agronomy decades to even partially recognize. Soil pH management. Most gardeners know that tomatoes prefer a slightly acidic to neutral soil pH between 6.0 and 6.8. Wood ash applied to the soil raises pH. Used incorrectly, meaning dumped in large quantities directly on acid-loving plants or sandy soils, it can cause problems. But applied in the specific way documented in Amish practice, modest dustings on the leaf surface and small amounts worked into compost rather than applied directly to soil in bulk, the pH effect is targeted, temporary on the leaf, and buffered in the soil by the organic matter content of a well-maintained garden bed. This is precision without instruments. This is knowledge calibrated over generations by observation, not by a soil test kit purchased at a garden center. A grower who has been managing his soil with compost for 20 years does not need to worry about wood ash acidifying or over-alkalizing his beds, because the organic matter buffers the amendment. The Amish understood this because they composted everything, kitchen scraps, manure, crop residue, and they had for generations. The soil was the system. The ash was one tool within a living system, not a standalone product plugged into depleted ground. That context is everything. And it is exactly the context that the synthetic input model destroyed, because depleted soil requires more inputs, which generates more sales, which funds more lobbying, which produces more policy that maintains the dependence. Now close that loop that was opened at the beginning of this video. The question was, how does a powder that costs less than $1 stop one of the most destructive plant diseases in the history of American agriculture? The answer is not simple, but it is plain. It creates a hostile surface environment for the pathogen. It strengthens the plant from the inside with potassium, calcium, and magnesium. It is applied with a timing knowledge that only generational observation produces. And it functions within a soil and composting system that keeps the whole equation in balance. None of those 4 elements can be patented. None of them can be bottled and sold at $14 a pound. And all 4 of them together produce what Amish farmers in Lancaster County, Holmes County, and LaGrange County have quietly demonstrated for over 200 years, a tomato crop that blight cannot take. What does this say about where American agriculture went? In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring and raised alarms about the chemical industry's impact on the natural world. The agrochemical industry responded with a coordinated campaign to discredit her. They called her a communist, a hysteric, a bad scientist. The USDA, under pressure from industry groups, distanced itself from her findings for years. The EPA was not even created until 1970, 23 years after FIFRA formalized the registration system that gave synthetic chemistry its institutional advantage over traditional practice. By the time any regulatory body was equipped to ask hard questions about what had been displaced, the displacement was already a generation deep. Your grandfather's wood ash bin had already been replaced by a shelf at the farm supply store. The knowledge was already fading. What you are holding right now, this understanding, is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is passive. This is active recovery of a practice that works, that costs nothing, that has been sustained in working farms across the American Midwest and Mid-Atlantic by communities who refused to let a commercial system tell them they needed to buy something they already had. The Amish did not save this because they were backward. They saved it because they were disciplined. They made a choice, a conscious, documented, theologically grounded choice to maintain autonomy over their food production in the face of every economic and cultural pressure pushing them toward dependence. That choice preserved something your county extension office could not. There is a question worth sitting with before you go back to your garden. What else did your grandfather know about his soil, his seeds, or his pests that you were never taught? Because by the time you came along, there was a product for it. Leave a comment below and tell us what your grandfather grew in his garden, or what your family lost when the supermarket replaced the root cellar. We read every single one. And if this video helped you understand something that has been buried for the better part of a century, give it a like and share it with someone who still thinks the